Okay. I'd like to thank the ISA for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'd also like to thank the organisers from GSR and from the university, particularly Hélène and Anne, for all the help they've done in trying to organise this. The title of my talk, Mind the Gap, comes from the announcements you'll hear on the London Underground as a tube train arrives. And just before you get on it, you get the warning, mind the gap. And I thought this was particularly appropriate because the title of my talk and the essence of my talk is going to be about giving a warning that there is a gap and we do have to mind it. So my presentation is going to be basically in 3 bits. It's going to be focusing on what we think we know about the basic habitats that are potentially going to be exploited, vents, seamounts, and manganese nodule provinces. I then want to go on to look at the problems with the traditional approaches to environmental assessment and monitoring, particularly as they're applied to the deep sea. And then I want to try and at least start the discussion about how do we deal with the taxonomic gap. So first of all, I want to move on to what we think we might know. This is a brief overview. You'll get a detailed overview from my colleagues who are experts in Meiofauna. As I've pointed out, I'm actually a macrofauna biologist. But the first thing to note about the Meiofauna in the deep sea is that it is actually a Meiofauna environment. This is a graph showing depth along here with the log of abundance. And this red area are the Meiofauna. And you can see that the Meiofauna are indeed abundant in the deep ocean. These are perhaps 1 million to 100,000 individuals in a square meter. That's really good news. It means that you can do some very robust statistics on that. But it's also bad news because there's a lot of individuals. It means a lot of identification, a lot of effort has to go into assessing the Meiofauna. Meiofauna are found in many environments, but not all elements, all groups of the Meiofauna are found in every habitat. So this is a summary of a vent, and you can see that here, for example, copepods are very abundant in particular kinds and particular areas of the vent, whereas nematodes are particularly common inside the mussel and tubeworm communities. And when you move on to the bare basalt areas away from the vent, this is areas potentially that might be the first that people will look at for massive sulfide deposits, you find that the foraminifera are very common. If we look at seamounts, you can see that within a seamount, the distribution of Meiofauna is very varied. So you need to be able to survey large areas of seamounts to be able to get a full indication of the Meiofaunal communities. When we actually look at the distribution of species across different seamounts, this is work we did in the Natural History Museum. Lucy Woodhall did this. This is looking at one particular family of nematodes. We looked at how they varied across seamounts in the southwest Indian Ocean. This is just south of the area that people are interested in the vent areas in the Indian Ocean. And what we found is that while there were species that seemed to occur only on one seamount, quite a number of the species occurred right across the seamount chain. So there's an indication that some of the Meiofauna might be actually widely distributed. If we look at patterns across a manganese nodule field in the manganese province, this is a study of looking at nematode biodiversity across a transect along a productivity gradient. The productivity gradient goes from north to south. So we're going from high productivity areas in the equator, becoming more and more oligotrophic. We looked at the numbers of species and also the abundance of nematodes across these stations. What we found is that if you look at The blue is the abundance. The abundance changes as you go north into the oligotrophic zones, and so do the number of species. So there seems to be some degree of an influence of productivity, and we have to bear this in mind in an area like the CCFZ or even in the Indian Ocean, that productivity and surface water exchanges are going to be important in understanding and assessing meiofaunal distributions and meiofaunal abundance. We decided to have a look at this, and what we wanted to do was we analysed the occurrence of species in different locations, in different stations. What we're interested to know is how widespread the species are. So we developed a classification based on the abundance of the species in the sample and the geographical distribution of between the different sites of those species. So we have categories we have are things like common species. Those are species that are actually found in all of the samples in fairly large numbers. We have species that are locally rare, but perhaps widespread, so that there's the green ones. What that means is these are species that you might find in one or two in the samples you've got, but actually they're found quite commonly right across the area that you're looking at. And then we have this blue group, which are species that are only ever found in one sample or only ever found with one or two individuals. And what we can see from this is that rare species are very common in the deep sea. And this presents us with a problem, because if such species are truly rare, then the risk of global total extinction for such species is high. But, and this is one of the problems, the recurring problems of looking in the deep sea, this could actually be an artifact caused by the fact there's not enough sampling undertaken to be able to determine whether these actually are rare or just not encountered very often. We can look at this in another way. This is the relative abundance of species in a system. When we see a slightly different picture, the relative contribution of rare species is actually quite small now. It's only 4% of the total fauna in terms of percentage abundance. The widespread species actually are the most abundant organisms. So, does this mean that we can actually ignore the rare species? Is it that they're actually not that important? Well, unfortunately, no, we can't. Because we know from looking at other ecosystems, particularly tropical forests or grasslands, that rare species often have unique ecological properties. They perform things in the environment that other species are not doing. And if you knock those out, then certain key ecosystem functions are also under threat and may be knocked out. So the question we keep coming to have to address is, are these species really rare, or are they just sampling artifacts? And I'll come back to this later on in the talk. The other thing we did with this analysis is we had a look at the distribution of the species from one end of the transect to the other. What we're really wanting to know is whether the impacts of mining will have a detrimental effect on species. And to understand that, we need to know their distribution. So widespread species that are found both at one end and the other end of a transect, are at less risk than those species that may be more localized. In this analysis, the table shows the analysis we did to try and to understand this. And what we're looking at is whether the species are what's called nested. That means that basically the fauna at one end of the transect is just a subset of the total fauna. Or do we look at turnover? And turnover means that the species at one end are actually different to the species at another end. And this result on the nematodes at the bottom here indicates in red here that the proportion of the fauna actually turns over at a scale of 1,000 kilometers. even though many of the species encountered are very widely distributed, it indicates that quite a high proportion of the species are actually restricted in their distribution. And if this is true and proved to be the case with more sampling, then the risk of extinction increases. And I come back to this point. The sampling is not enough for us to be categorical in our assessment of whether that is a true reflection of what is going on in the environment. So, Meiofauna are common in all areas with mineral resource potential. Some taxa are more abundant in some habitats than others. Meiofauna respond to large-scale productivity gradients, which affect their abundance, their biodiversity. But the data we have on spatial distributions is inconsistent. Many of the species are represented by only one or just a few individuals in the sampling programs we have at the moment. And sampling biases need to be addressed. So what we did under a project that was funded by the European Union was to undertake a gap analysis for what information we had on biodiversity and biogeography. To just find out, for example, just what we knew about the taxonomy of the areas that we're interested in today. What taxonomic keys were available? Were there collections? Collections are really important. It's one way you compare what you have with what other people have collected to see if you have the same species. These are important resources for assessing biodiversity. What mechanisms were available to exchange information and data between different groups of people doing work? We had a look at sampling. What was the sampling coverage like? Were molecular samples being taken? Was the sampling standardized? So were one group doing the same thing as another group? We also wanted to look at this biogeographical aspect. What was our current understanding of the biogeographic patterns and drivers? Again, this is important if we're going to understand whether mining in one area is going to cause irreversible damage, whether whether the risk of extinction of species is total or whether it's local. What we came out with is a knowledge grid. This is a summary of information from CCFZ, Ghent, and Seabed. Now, I'm not going to ask you to read all that. It's a very dense table. The headline for this, the take-home message, is that there are huge gaps in our knowledge. There are no keys to the fauna or meiofauna of the CCFZ, Ghent, or Seabed. There are no monographs to help us in this. We're starting to collect some molecular samples, which might help, but generally speaking, we're in the early stages of that. The good news is that we are actually all standardizing around the same sort of collecting methodologies. But in terms of biogeographic information, there's so much, the spatial coverage of the sampling is so restricted that we are unable to say anything very much about how animals are distributed in the deep ocean, in these habitats. I can summarize this in a very sort of straightforward way. This is what we call a red, amber, green analysis. Red means that most of the information we have is either primary scientific information or we don't have any information at all. Amber means there's some useful information out there, but it's actually quite scattered and some fairly significant gaps exist. And green suggests that we actually do have something that we could use to make predictions and have reasonable confidence that what we were predicting was accurate. You can see for the meiofauna that actually most of it is either red or amber. Effectively, we have very large gaps in our understanding of this particular group in the deep ocean. So the current state of the art, that's interesting. That was a full slide a minute ago. Okay, basically, we have been doing this now for over 20 years. And there are still very significant gaps in what we know about the deep ocean. So what? Why should this matter? Well, it matters because of the regulations in the Convention of the Law of the Sea. Article 145 of Part 11, which we should all know by heart by now, states, ensure the effective protection of the marine environment from harmful effects which may arise from such activities. If we really have got such large gaps, the precautionary principle will be invoked and the development of mining affected. So it's in all our interests to ensure that the environmental assessments and baseline studies we undertake now are as scientifically rigorous as possible. We need to know quite a lot about the deep ocean if we're going to understand and overcome the reservations that many people have about this. Each contract shall require the contractor to gather environmental baseline data to establish environmental baselines. What we need to know are what species are present. We basically need to come up with basic species inventories. This is the taxonomy that we're talking about. We need to understand how species are connected. This is the genetic diversity of the system. How species are distributed between and within habitats, by geography. This leads to assessment of extinction risks. How species diversity and abundance change with time. This is time series, because this gives us the resilience of the ecosystem and the species. We need to understand the role of the species in the environment. This is about ecosystem functioning, and it's never been more important to understand ecosystem functioning in a planet that is getting warmer. The deep sea is one of the areas that locks up carbon. If we start mucking around with the major carbon sinks because we don't understand ecosystem functioning, then that may put the kinds of things that happened in Paris last week in jeopardy. The physiological tolerances of the species. We need to understand species resilience to the impacts of potentially the release of heavy metals or sediment coming in from the system. And finally, we need to know the reproductive biology. This is about recolonization and survival after mining. These are the key questions that that should be driving the environmental assessments we're making now. This is because there are no standard baselines available to us to compare with what you're doing at the moment. This is a problem facing both academics and contractors. The problem is that the deep sea is unexplored. Effectively, each baseline is a research project in its own right. So it is important that the environmental baseline programs are properly planned and funded. It's crucial that the information from such studies is made available quickly and widely and published if possible. This is because it will allow the scientific community to provide the scrutiny which will actually validate the work. Now, the problem that we all potentially face in environmental work, and this has been the case in the offshore oil industry, is how it is actually carried out. Areas for exploitation are parcelled up, and each parcel is then opened up for contract. This often means that you get many contractors in a particular area. And what tends to happen then is a contractor will offer a contract to do the environmental impact assessment. Lots of companies will then bid. One is then awarded the contract. They go off and do the work. The client gets the report. The next contract's issued, and so we go round a loop. This is a closed loop process. There's very little external scrutiny of this. What happens is that many different consulting companies then end up being involved over the course of a long-term project. Well, the problem with this is that it only works if you understand the fauna. It only works if you have a consulting company that has good, competent taxonomists. The problem is the reports and the material, particularly the specimens, stay with the client or the contractor and the company. And there's no external scrutiny of this, so there's no quality assurance. For monitoring, unless the same company gets the contract, And in many countries, there are anti-competition laws which prevent that happening. Then there's no continuity between one contract and the next. This means that there's no way that you can actually marry the results with any great confidence between one study and another study, or between one contractor and another contractor. None of the new species which are encountered are ever described in the scientific literature, because there's no time and there's never any money in the contract to do so. Contracts are usually time constrained and are usually constrained in the ability of the people to actually make the information available. So this leads to poor quality monitoring, and it can actually fail to detect the changes you're looking for. Environmental studies in shallow water frequently take good samples, and this is actually true in the deep sea. Many of the contractors going into the deep sea are taking amazingly good samples, samples that the scientific community don't get to do because our grants don't allow us to do as much as you do. And they're often identified by competent people, certainly in shallow water. But the samples are never stored in a museum in shallow water systems, or a collections facility, where other people can study them. Why is that important? I'll come back to this point. Specimens are the only piece of evidence that you have that the data was collected and identified, and the data from which you then subsequently do your analysis is actually accurate. Data from the reports is often embargoed, so the company doesn't want the information to get out until it's actually undertaken some of the work. It's never released, or it inhabits a world of what we call the grey literature. So it becomes very difficult to get at, even in these days of Google, where you can get at most things. This procedure actually inhibits good environmental monitoring, because there's no connection between the different areas to see if wide-scale changes are happening. I know this from areas like the West African margin, where different oil companies in different countries do different kinds of work. And what happens is they never talk to one another. So the samples tend to be scattered throughout Europe or the United States or Africa, wherever they happen to be. There's no coherent plan of action. So large-scale changes in that ecosystem are going to be incredibly difficult to detect. That means that you're not going to be able to detect and tell apart an impact from, in this case, oil and gas, with something that might be happening in the environment generally. In an area like the CCFZ, our ability to tell the difference between a big El Nino productivity event and, say, a mining event might be very difficult to tell, unless we have coherent, joined-up thinking between everybody involved. Access to the collections and data is actually part of the audit process. This is one thing that I think many people fail to understand. I come back to this point. The specimens of what, and the identifications of those specimens, are the basis for all the other ecological interpretation. If you get that wrong, all the interpretation is rubbish. And all too frequently, the samples and specimens are thrown away at the end of a study, and the data is lost in somebody's hard drive somewhere. This is a recurring problem. Getting the data to do any of the kind of analysis is incredibly difficult. So, I think what my message to you, I suppose, in this is we ought to be thinking about this in a slightly different way. Environmental studies, particularly in the area, should not be seen as a task that is carried out to fulfill some regulatory obligation, which I think too often it is. It's seen as we have to do this because the regulations say we have to do this. Yes, that's true. But environmental studies have the ability to provide important information on the biodiversity of the deep ocean, the processes which affect life, and actually to make important contributions to the understanding of our planet. The challenge we have, the challenge of the people in this room, and the challenge of the other people who are doing the contracts, is how do we make this happen? How do we communicate this knowledge, not just within ourselves, but more widely? Because without convincing scientific information, it's going to be very difficult to convince civil society and the scientific community that the precautionary principle should not be applied. So, effective environmental studies require good quality sampling programs. They should reflect the environmental heterogeneity of the local ecological conditions. Ecologically meaningful. Ecologically meaningful means you're taking enough samples to have statistical rigor to the analysis you undertake. We should be using appropriate technologies. That's not just molecular. We should be using IT technologies as well to integrate the information across the systems, between contractors and between the academics and contractors. We should have time series to be able to discriminate natural from anthropogenic change. As I was explaining earlier, how do you detect whether it's an El Nino effect or something that you did when we went mining? Good quality data starts with good taxonomic resolution. This is why we're at these workshops, is to try and explain and try to help get to that level of good taxonomic resolution. Everything else is based on this. Good data storage. We need to understand that specimens and sample archiving are important. And open access to data helps to establish reliable and reproducible information that everybody can use. And the most important, I think, is communication. Communication not just within your group, but communication between the contractors, communication between the academics and the contractors. We need to create a framework where people feel able to exchange information, particularly non-commercial information like environmental information. The more information we have and we pull together, the more easily it will be to us to start to address some of the major environmental issues that we face in the deep sea. Sampling programs. Basically, this is what is already available in some of this. Excuse my slide, it seems to just decided to slide off. Sampling effectively. This graph here, which has lost all of it, along the side here are the numbers of samples, and up here are the numbers of species. This is a macrofauna example. I couldn't find a Meiofauna example. And basically what this shows is this is the species accumulation curve. And it starts to sort of even out a little bit about there. This is an estimator of the species richness based on those sample sets. And it starts to basically level out about there. That is about 30 box cores. That's in an area of very low productivity in the western side of the Clipperton-Clarion fracture zone. Now with Meiofauna, because they're more abundant, I would expect that red line to be down there. But it indicates that you have to actually collect quite a lot of cores to be able to estimate the true number of species you're likely to be in the area. This graphic here was given to me by my colleagues in Germany, and it's here to remind people that the deep sea is not a homogeneous environment. It is not flat abyssal plains going on forever. It is actually heterogeneous on a number of scales, from the very local to the very large. This is geographic topography showing seamounts, but it also shows troughs, small ridges. So there is a huge degree of heterogeneity, and to get a handle on that, we need to structure the sampling programs accordingly. More samples mean more individuals. More individuals mean that we're likely to encounter more species. This will require increased taxonomic effort. How are we going to do that? And I think there are a number of ways we can do that. First of all, mobilize and build on the existing expertise. Use that to train people up. Use those people to help you, and that's already happening. Many of the contractors are already linking in with good teams. So we've already heard, for example, that Anne and Elaine have been working with GSR. I know that Pedro is working with BGR and his team. So there is already links, but we need to make that, we need to mobilize that across the whole group of contractors. We integrate modern methods such as molecular, you're going to be hearing about that in the course of the talks, but also IT. IT to help make that information available. IT to help release the information that is locked in people's hard drives. Exchange information and build knowledge by holding intercalibration and expert workshops, bringing together researchers and contractors. This mechanism actually improves the skill base. It gets everybody up to the same level. This is not new. People in shallow water have been doing this for years. This is a standard way of getting everybody in the community looking at the same kind of animals to understand and to have a unified taxonomy. The other way we could do this is exchange visit and scientific programs to enable researchers to work up material and to make the data available between the different labs. The most important, unfortunately, at the bottom of this, is that we need to fund this. Because taxonomic experts can't work for free. We have mortgages too. We have kids, you know, and Christmas is coming. We need to pay for that. So we need to think seriously about how we mobilize what resources we've got to really try and improve the taxonomic base. Right, I'm nearly... Right. Part of this is going to require good data management, given the information that's likely to be coming out. Good data management practices are critical to establishing the standards before and during mining activities. So, for example, during the exploration phase, joint working groups on key subjects such as taxonomy, biodiversity assessment, these are already happening. We're already doing that. This workshop is part of that process. These are important. We keep them going. It doesn't have to be a workshop. We don't have to travel around the world to do this. We can do this virtually now. But this is essential for establishing quality assurance. Mobilizing expertise between contractors and academic researchers speeds up data processing accuracy. This enhances the credibility with external reviewers and society at large. If the data is made available, it's open, it's being dealt with by acknowledged experts, then it becomes very difficult to argue against that. Establishing protocols for access and long-term storage of samples. This is fundamental. Too often I have seen contract samples, which are valuable in their own right, disappear, be thrown away, not be available. Come back to this point. It's the only piece of data, the only piece of evidence we have that we can reliably look at in terms of what happened at that particular point in time. How did you identify that? Is that really accurate? Again, establishing access. All too often these reports, I come back to this again, the reports are not made available. This is environmental data. This is not commercially sensitive. The more we understand the environment, the easier it will be to make management and sustainable management decisions. Currently, at the moment, we're in the dark. One positive thing that we could actually do, I think, and it's one of the things we need to discuss in terms of this workshop, is what is the skill gap analysis? Where are the areas where contractors feel they need the support? How are we going to do that? How are we going to build the links between academic institutes for those contractors who need access to it? We've had a number of suggestions from the recommendations from previous workshops. For example, we've a taxonomic clearinghouse mechanism. What this basically is a list of expertise that's available through academic registers or taxonomic lists that would enable contractors who are looking for particular groups of people or particular expertise to be able to go on a one-to-one basis and say, we would like you to help us. We need to think about developing mechanisms that make the information available. So, for example, websites. If you look at some of the shallow water systems that people have set up, there's an organization called Seabed, the Southern California Association of Marine Taxonomists. They have a website which regularly exchanges taxonomic information. They have online meetings on a regular basis to make sure everybody understands that this new worm is this particular species. they publish. So this is the kind of infrastructure which I think we collectively need to set up to enable us to deal with a major challenge that is the deep sea. How are we going to fund this? Well, I think there's a number of actions. You may all sort of have your own views. I'm going to put mine. I think there are two particular areas. There are actions to support individual contractors. Where you have an individual problem, well, that should be funded through the individual contractor. We're already seeing this, contract to employ scientific expertise. So that's already happening, that's a good thing. We need to make sure that happens in a much wider scale. We need to have the ability to visit, to bring experts into particular labs. Or perhaps you want to send your people to an expert's lab to spend, say, 6 months or a year working with them to work up the samples. Because that's the way you would enhance your local expertise and get a trained person at the end of it. Send specimens to experts for verification. I surveyed the taxonomists from the last 2 workshops about what they felt we could do to carry on this process. And one of the things they said was they would like to see these specimens. They'd like to help and identify and verify these specimens. The other thing I think, which is perhaps something that hasn't been done, I haven't seen it very often, but maybe thought of, is joint contractors coming together to create a postdoc or a PhD student to work on all of the data of a particular group. So for example, if you had a problem with a crustacea group or Meiofauna, you might decide that actually we can't necessarily afford to do this all on our own, but it would be good if we could get together with somebody else. We put the money together and we come to somebody like Anne or one of the Meiofauna people and say, we'd like to work up all of the data across all of our sites so that we have a unified system. Keep coming back to the point, this is non-sensitive, non-commercial. This is a very good and very useful way, cost-effective way of perhaps bringing together lots of people to work on what is a big problem, the taxonomic problem. Something to think about. Then there are multi-contractor inter-comparisons. These are actions that might be supported through the ISA or through ISA working with various other organs. We develop a central hub for the dissemination, perhaps a website or something similar. Develop a clearinghouse mechanism where basically it's a bit like speed dating. On one side you have the taxonomic experts, and on the other side you have the people who want taxonomic expertise. Intercalibration workshops. You get people who have data, who have specimens, who want to get together to solve a particular problem. You get the experts into the room. At the end, what you get is not just the usual report, you actually get taxonomic papers that are out, that are put onto the scientific literature and made available. Problems are solved, it's made the information, the solutions are made available after the workshops. Training courses, ranging from perhaps people who want to know the basics right through to people who might want to know something more detailed. These are actually generated by the need of the contractors. And then also we ought to think about exchange visits. We did this very successfully in the Seabed project that Pedro led. A number of contractors had sample sets that they were finding it difficult to get worked up. And using the Seabed funding, we provided travel money and also subsistence money for various experts to spend time in the labs of these contractors. And they worked up the material. That material was then published and made available. It's a very simple, very straightforward way of doing it. It doesn't necessarily cost a huge amount of money, but it is actually very cost effective that way. So, in summary, we face a major challenge. The deep sea is not like shallow water in that regard. It is effectively a new environment, an unexplored environment. If we're going to do environmental assessment, we need to produce scientifically credible data and information. Sampling has to be based on good scientific principles, reflecting the complexity of the various deep sea ecosystems with mining potential. With the practices and protocols of monitoring the deep sea, taxonomy is the key underpinning activity to this. It needs to be supported, it needs to be resourced properly. If the baselines are going to have any scientific or societal credibility. Certain elements need to be considered as integral into the monitoring process, such as sample storage. You need to put adequate resources. And resources is not just about time. It's about where are you going to put them, and it's about the time to actually sort it out and put them away. We need to develop a more collaborative approach, I think. The only way we're going to solve some of the major questions that we are facing at the moment and the challenges that we are facing at the moment is to think less of us as little silos of different contractors, as a group of people who have a particular interest in a particular part of the world. And if we don't start working together to solve some of the major challenges we face, then the potential for us moving forward to mining is going to be slim to nil. So in terms of this workshop, I think we need to, what I hope we get out of this is, why is taxonomy important? And I think it's pivotal, my personal view is pivotal in determining environmental risk. But it's not just about identification, it's about making identifications available. Why do we need to develop these collaborations? Because the area is so big. What role will new technologies play? In this molecular digital age, we need to look at all of the tools available to us to take us forward. The other thing I think that we need to discuss within this is, where do we go from here? And with that, thank you. I'm happy to take questions, but I suspect I've harangued you long enough. Bye-bye.
Wonderful as far as identifying the challenges are concerned. I have small concern from the contractor point of view. I am representing contractors, so I thought I will take that first. If we are, as a scientific, we are talking about challenges. There are a lot of gaps in the knowledge, the required knowledge. There are no expert as well as expertise available, and keys, for example, monographs for some of the area. The data you presented for CCF, which is the most studied area from the mining point of view, in the deep sea area. And if those type of information which are required for taxonomies are not available, which needs to be certainly upgraded, or we have to acquire those things, then is it good from our part to ask the contractor, this is for Seabed authority now, is it good part to ask the contractor mandatory questions that this should be done, this needs to be done? Instead of that, can we ask the contractor, these are the desired things, because they cannot do it unless we provide them the required knowledge from the scientific side. From the Seabed authorities, it will be always better to ask the question. These are the desired things. You should be doing it. But if you put it mandatory, then we can't give the answer. Because there are gaps, scientific gaps. I thought.
Well, I'll answer on my personal behalf. I'm not associated with the Seabed, so this is a personal view. It's very interesting to see that both the scientific community and also society at large have started to become very interested in the exploitation of mineral resources. At the Deep Sea Conference in Portugal this year, there were 2 major sessions on the exploitation of marine environment. And that was the first time I've seen that in the Deep Sea Conference. Usually it's a parallel session that's done, and it's a morning or a very small bit. But this time round there was a big interest. And I think the onus is not that we try to dilute what we do, but that we actually step up what we try to do, because we are going to be held to account, both the scientists and also the contractors, as to what we are actually doing. And if we say that we can't deal with these challenges, or we find it difficult to deal with these challenges, how credible is that when you're confronted with Greenpeace, or you're confronted with the Friends of the Earth, when people say to you, you shouldn't be mining, and you have no answer to this. So the way we have to address this situation, and I'm not pro or anti-mining, I'm basically saying that if we're going to make the decision, it has to be made on the best possible scientific evidence available. We can't afford at this particular moment, as far as I'm concerned, to dilute our efforts. This is why I think it's important that we mobilize what information, what expertise is available to us. And I honestly believe that there is a degree of information, but we have been an expertise, but we have been very reluctant to actually use it for all sorts of reasons, which I don't need to tell you because you're already working in that environment. But as an external person, as somebody who has come to this as basically a taxonomist and deep sea ecologist, I don't think we can afford not to address these challenges.
I agree with you, Bob, on that we need kind of catalogs or handbooks of the fauna, and this is not really available for the ECZ or for the nodule habitat. There are some catalogs. There is a handbook of hydrothermal vent fauna, which is extremely useful. You have all the species there from different parts of the world. And in the first Meiofauna workshop that we did in Wilhelmshaven, it was very important for us to produce not only a report, but to produce an atlas of the images of the megafauna. And this has been extremely useful for the different cruises that have taken part during last year and so on. And I think that we need some catalogs for the nematodes and for the copepods and chylorines or whatever, that you can really go there and look, and every contractor can then use the same standardized taxonomy and everything. I think there are two problems associated to producing these catalogs. One is, of course, we need some money, because somebody needs to sit down and write and collect all the information. But the other problem is that even if we would have money now to pay somebody to do it, start right away tomorrow, this person will not be able to start right away, because we still need to process a lot of samples and information. We are not really there for many groups to really know what is the fauna living in this habitat. But definitely we will need to move in this direction, because this will be the most important thing that somebody could have in his hands, to the contractors to identify the animals and move forward with the analysis.
I agree that it's the first thing that we need to do. When you study an area, the first thing you need to do is figure out what we know about it, but we don't have any one place where we can go and see where that's happening. So I completely agree with that. One thing with the CCZ in the Pacific is that it's overwhelming, the amount of, both in terms of space and biodiversity, it's overwhelming. So it's really difficult for anyone to know where to start. So first you need to know how much is known, and then you need to know how much you need to know. We've had an experience in New Zealand recently where there was a mining company interested in mining phosphorite nodules within the EEZ. And they did their very best to provide all the environmental protection, environmental data they could. But we did that without really knowing what they needed to actually provide. They had a guess at that. They guessed what they needed to provide, but in the end it wasn't sufficient. So the whole exercise was a waste of time in the end. And we can never have perfect information, but at some point it has to be enough. And we need to figure out where that point is. Otherwise we'll be doing scattered work in all sorts of areas I know this may not amount to enough if we don't have a goal in mind. So it's one thing that we should all keep in the back of our heads is where is that goal that we're all trying to go to.
I just have a comment. I'm speaking from the point of view of the regulator, the administrator. We give out contracts which are based on years. An exploration contract is for 15 years. We had in effect exploration contracts by at least 7 contractors before it became quite apparent that we needed to do something about the taxonomy of these animals. We had 5, 6, 7 years of work doing this. They had been submitting data and information to us. For that group of contractors, the exploration contracts expire starting from next year. This is the third in the series of workshops that we're doing on this matter. When we go back to their annual reports, which provide us with information on the data they've acquired in the course of the year, and we try to compare whatever we've been talking about in relation to the fauna over the past few years, compare that to the data and information we're given, you don't see very much. It could be exactly what you're saying. There's no catalog. I have difficulty dealing with the fact that we have to determine this, we have to determine that. This is ongoing. Last session, July this year, we started getting bombarded with emails, in particular the members of the Legal and Technical Commission. These emails kept asking the same question. What are you doing to protect the marine environment from activities of mining? They went a step further to suggest that mining was taking place, which it isn't. But the point was very clear. While I appreciate that, this work hasn't been done, maybe what we should be talking about is how do we get it done, and even if it indicates that it's at this point, this is what we know. I can't see waiting until we've gone through the entire exercise before we do this work. If we need to put catalogs together, it'd be useful to find out what are we talking about in relation to costs. But from my vantage point, we need to ensure that what we're getting from the contractors are these kind of standardized taxonomies, and we can work with them to do the relevant things we need to. We have a legal and technical commission that is going to advise the council whether areas should be mined or whether they shouldn't. We are at the point where we've been asked to do environmental management plans for all the areas that people are interested in, be it nodules, be it crusts, or be it sulfides. We have one that we are working on with the nodules in the CCZ. Some areas of particular environmental interest have been identified. It is expected that we are supposed to be getting data and information from just about everybody, including contractors, to assist us with this plan. It's not obvious to me from what I've seen that we have much data to do this kind of work. At least at this point, we don't have a heck of a lot to report, but it's requested of us. They've done the same thing in relation to crust. They've done the same thing in relation to sulfides. If you can see exploration contracts for sulfides in a particular area, quote unquote, we should do an environmental management plan for that area. Same thing with crust. I'd like the process to move forward, and I think it would be helpful from what I've understood from the question about how you asked Pedro. I think it'd be useful if we could come up with some type of catalog at this point. I'm sure we can put in the necessary language to indicate that this is not the beginning and end of a catalog on this particular group of folk. But I think the exercise must start. We must encourage the contractors to use this as much as possible, including some of the suggestions you made in your presentation. But I think it's a very good idea. And later on, after we've gone through this part of the workshop and the practical part, in some of the plenary discussions, maybe we can discuss this a bit more. But we have to do something. We can't just sit back and say, I have to find a way for the Legal and Technical Commission and the authority itself to respond to this bombardment of emails saying we're doing absolutely nothing. In part because nobody sees anything to our assembly or anywhere else to say this is what the Seabed authority is doing. Thank you.
Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
go ahead.
I think
Tea, coffee.
it's already a very important discussion going on here. What I would like to suggest is that we have our coffee break first, and then we still can proceed with our discussion. We, as I said, we saved some time. So I definitely don't want to interrupt these important issues that are mentioned here by different people. But let's have a coffee and we continue then. We have the coffee in the same place as this morning in the back of the room.